If you give people more to digest than they can manage, you're going to get back some fraction of that. So that's one thing. Second thing that happens is if it's too complex, a lot of times people will pick what they want to do, which may not have anything to do with the agenda that you want to set for the organization.
Hello and welcome to the Agile Innovation Leaders podcast. I'm Ola Ojako. On this podcast, I speak with world-class leaders and doers about themselves and a variety of topics spanning agile, lean innovation, business, leadership, and much more, with actionable takeaways for you, the listener. My guest for this episode is Dr. Rita McGrath. She's a best-selling author, sought-after speaker and advisor, and consistently ranked in the top 10 management thinkers in the world, including number 1 for strategy in Thinkers 50. In this episode, Rita talks about the concept of inflection points from her book, Seeing Around Corners, and how as leaders we can train ourselves to spot these inflection points and act on the information we receive. She also talked about the importance of making complex things simple for the people we work with. I learned a lot speaking with Rita, and I'm sure that you will find this conversation insightful as well. Thank you again for watching. It's an honor to have you on the show, Rita McGrath. Many thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you all. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. Now, could you tell us about yourself? How did the Dr. Rita McGrath we know today evolve?
Well, it would have to start with my parents, of course. I mean, all great stories start with your parents. And so my parents were both scientists. My mother was a microbiologist and my father was an organic chemist. And so I grew up in a house where a question couldn't be answered. You went and got the reference book and figured it out. And both, incredible respect for science and for diligence. And, the house was always full of books and lots of emphasis on learning. I wouldn't say we were financially all that well off. We weren't poor by any means, but it was, there wasn't like a lot of money to spare, but there was always money for books, and there was always money for, educational experiences and that kind of thing. So that's the household I grew up in. And then, so my parents, when I was born, were both on the staff at the Yale Medical School. So they were both researchers there. And then my dad in the late 60s got an offer to go join this upstart fledgling company that was at the cutting edge of all kinds of things in his field. And that was Xerox Corporation. And he was very conflicted about leaving academia, but went off eventually to Xerox. So we moved the family to Rochester, New York. So that's where I did most of my growing up. And my mother at that time decided to stay home, more or less. And then she started a scientific translation business. So she moved into an entrepreneurial career more than her scientific career. And then when it came time to go to college, I went to Barnard College in the city of New York. I'd always thought New York was an amazing place and was accepted there. So went off to New York, did my bachelor's and my master's in political science and public policy. I was very interested in public policy and matters of social contract and those kinds of things. And then my first job was actually with the city of New York. I ran purchasing systems for government agencies. So, it doesn't sound very glamorous, but today we would call it digital transformation. It was the very first wave of companies taking their operations in a digital form. And it was very exciting and I learned a lot. Then I got to the end of, the thing about public service is when you start, there's unlimited sort of growth that you can happen for a few years, and then it really just levels off and you're never going to go beyond that. So I kind of reached that headroom and decided to do something different.
Was it at that point that you decided to go for your PhD?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, that was one of the options I was considering. And my husband basically said, look, if you get into a top 5 school, it's worth doing. And if you don't, it's probably not. But you have to think in that time, MBA programs were just exploding. And there'd been a lot of pressure on the administrators of MBA programs to put PhD accredited faculty in front of their students. The big knock against the MBA at the time was, oh, they're just trade schools. We've got some guy who ran a tire company comes in and talks, and that's not really academically suitable. And so there was a huge pressure for schools to find PhD accredited people. That's now, that still exists, but the market pressures have changed a lot. But when I was doing my PhD, it was pretty sure I would get a job if I managed to complete the degree. So that gave me that extra input to do that.
Did you already have children when you started the PhD?
Yes.
And how did you cope?
Our son was, how old was he? He would have been 9 months old when I started my PhD program. Yeah, it was a
9
challenge.
months old.
Yeah, wow. It was a real challenge. And I guess everybody manages those kinds of challenges in their own way. But yeah, it was a struggle because, a typical day would be, get up, get the baby to daycare or wherever, and then do school or whatever I had to do that day. And then it was sort of pick them up. By the time I had a second child, it was pick them up, get them dinner, get them bath time, get them story, and then I'd be back at my desk at 9 o'clock at night trying to do what I needed to do. So it was it was tough. It was difficult years. Not joyful years. I don't begrudge them, but it was just hard to fit everything in.
I can imagine. Although I'm thinking of starting my PhD, my children aren't that small, but I do remember the time, I was still working full time. So the challenge is you'd go to work and then you come back to work, to another type of work. And then when they go to bed, the work continues. It's interesting.
Quite exhausting.
You can say that. I'm so glad they're not in diapers anymore. So it's baby steps. We're getting there. So can we go on to your book, Seeing Around Corners, How to Spot Inflection Points in Business Before They Happen? I'd like to start from an unusual place in the book. I started from the dedication page and, reading everything. And I noticed that, you refer to one of the conversations you had, the last conversations you had with your mother. Mm-hmm. Could you tell us about that?
Oh, sure. She was, at the time she was quite ill. She had sarcoma in her lung, and she was quite ill. It's a horrible disease, and we haven't got any real treatments for it. So the recommendation is you do chemo, and that really knocks you out. So she was quite ill and sort of migrating between her chair and the couch and her chair and the couch. And in one of those conversations, she just said, "I want you to know I'm proud of you, and I've had a good life, and I'm prepared for whatever comes next." And I thought that was lovely of her to say. And I thought in that moment to pass it on to all these other women. And, you bring up motherhood and being a working woman and all those complicated emotions that come with that, because there seems to be guilt around every corner. If you're not at home full time, clearly you're a terrible mom, and if you're not at work full time, you're a terrible worker. And I think so many of those things are just designed to twist us up into little balls. And when I look at my own mother's experience, she was a working woman. I grew up, I think I'm third or fourth generation working woman, so it never even occurred to me that wouldn't be possible. But I think what often is missing is this validation, that for women who are trying to, make their way professionally and be great, responsible parents and do all these other things, that often there's a sense of a lack of self-worth. I'm not doing enough. The more I hear that,
I feel like most days I feel like that. Sometimes I ask my children, am I a good mom?
I think part of it too is we, and I'll say we, sort of baby boomer mothers and maybe a little younger, we got ourselves all tangled up in this. If it's not like organic, hand processed lima beans with, organic succotash mixed in, it's not good baby food. Honestly, Gerber's exist to provide perfectly nutritious food for really young babies, and they've been doing it for decades. And you can trust that. And if it makes your life easier, go with it.
Thank you.
I think we get ourselves all tossed up in like, what does good mean? Honestly, the kids don't mind. They'd celebrate if it was chicken finger night.
Let's go to the book. Because in your book you said it's about how to spot inflections before they happen in business. Can you give us examples of maybe businesses that had these inflection points occur and they failed to recognize it, and what was the impact?
Sure. Well, let's take one that is quite sad to me, which is Intel. And Intel built its, Intel went through a major inflection point. In fact, the originator of the concept was Andy Grove, who was their former CEO. And he talked about his inflection points in his book, Only the Paranoid Survive, which is brilliant, a brilliant, brilliant book. And one of the reasons I wrote my book was that very little had been done since his book on that topic. And Grove built this incredible company, Intel, and they were making microprocessor chips, and they were very, very powerful, very fast chips. And so the assumptions inside Intel's business model was what customers were going to pay for was faster, 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 more computation power, more and more powerful. But what they didn't really think about was energy consumption. And as the world went more mobile, so the Intel product is the PC, and the PC, the desktop PC, remains firmly plugged into the wall. And then maybe we make PC chips that maybe have slightly lower power consumption to power PCs, but it's still that notion of power, and I think the inflection point that caught Intel by surprise, to some extent, was this movement towards mobile, where the vast majority of chips being made were these completely different architecture chips by companies like ARM, and companies like that, which from their inception recognized that low power was the way to go. Then they weren't very powerful in the sense of speed, which is what Intel was driving its business towards, but they were powerful in the sense of ubiquitous, low power, long battery life, that kind of thing. And I think that's an example of the kind of assumption that can cause a company to get into trouble when the underlying shift in the business environment says, wait a minute, this thing you've been building all this time may not be what is needed by the marketplace.
That's interesting. So it brings me to the point you made about, the indicators, the early warnings, and you mentioned the concept of, lagging, current, and leading indicators. And there was an emphasis in your book on, leading indicators. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Sure. Well, so leading indicators are today's information about tomorrow's possibilities. And what we unfortunately rely on a lot in business is lagging indicators. So profits, performance, ROI, all those things are lagging, decision that you made a long time ago. So the concept of leading indicators is to try to get business leaders to think about what would have to be true, before I was able to make a certain decision. What are the leading indicators? So an example would be back in the 90s, computer scientists all over the world realized that come the year 2000, come the turn of the millennium, that the way computer programs had been programmed was only 2 digits for the year. And so when the year went to 00, yes, computers were going to think it was 1900. And this was going to be terrible because they all get out of sync, and planes would drop out of the sky, and nuclear plants were going to become unstable, and we should all move to Montana and stockpile wheat. I don't know if you can remember the predictions.
Yeah, the Y2K bug.
Oh my goodness.
It was a big sensation, yes.
Apocalyptic, remember? And yet when the big moment came, the year 2000, what happened? Well, nothing happened. Why did nothing happen? We looked at that early warning and we said, whoa, if that happens, it's bad. And so companies, prodded by their accounting firms, prodded by other security considerations, invested billions in correcting that flaw. And so that's an example of an early warning. And there are a couple of things to understand about early warnings. So the first important thing is the measure of a good early warning is not, did it predict what happened? The measure of a good leading indicator is, did it help you prepare for what might happen? And so I think that's a really important distinction, because we oftentimes say, oh, that didn't predict this or that, but that's not the point. The point is, did it help you think more broadly about what might happen so that you could be prepared? So I think that's the first thing. The second thing to remember about leading indicators is they're often not quantitative in the way that we like to think about quantitative things. They're often qualitative. They often take the form of stories, and they often come from what I'll call unrepresentative parts of your mental ecosystem. So, it's that person on the loading dock who says, well, that's weird. A customer never asked for that before. Or the person answering the phone, in headquarters going, well, I don't understand why they need to know that information. They've never that, it's those little anomalies or things that depart from business as usual that are often the weak signals that you need to be paying attention to.
So can you give us an example where of how we can go about choosing good leading indicators?
Well, in the book, I describe a technique that I use, which is you take a couple of uncertainties and juxtapose them on each other. And that gives you 4 or more, you can do this for as many as you like, stories from the future, possible futures that we could live in. And then depending on which one you want to think about, you say, okay, I'm going to write a headline as if it came from a newspaper story about that scenario. And I'm going to work backward and say what has to be true for that headline to emerge. So take an example that's playing out right now, chronic and accelerating decline in birth rates in the United States, that people are just deciding not to enlarge their families or not to start their families at all, and for very good reasons. The level of social support for families is very low. Mostly women are bearing the burden, and very often women are the ones that make a large part of the decision about whether the family is going to grow or not.
Yeah.
And so we're facing a real baby bust. Well, if that's true and we follow that along, well, what are some things that would be early warnings or indicators of what that world would be like? Well, you'll see a decline of working people relative to retired people or people needing assistance. You'll see fewer kids with more resources to support them. So the kind of baby prince phenomena we saw in China, and there's lots of things you can kind of work through. But once you say, okay, I see a world with 1 million fewer children 3 years from now than we would have expected. Well, okay, what now working backward, what does that tell us we need to be paying attention to today?
Yes. That's a great example. I wonder though, so given all the research that has led to, and your experience as well, consulting with, most of these large organizations, the case studies you've come to witness and all that, what would be your advice to leaders of such organizations, in terms of how they can better prepare themselves or equip themselves to recognize these inflection points and lead effectively?
Well, I think the first principle is you have to be discovery driven. In other words, you have to be curious about what's going on. And if you're the kind of leader who someone brings you a piece of information and instead of treating it like a gift, you're like, oh no, you don't understand. That's wrong. That's not the way the world works. If you're dismissive of information people are bringing you, that's very dangerous. Because the information you need is not going to come from your lieutenants at headquarters. It's going to come from that guy on the loading dock who says, this is weird. So I think you want to think about establishing some kind of information flows that go directly from where the phenomena are happening to your desk. So as an example, a company I really admire is the German metal services company, Klockner. And their CEO, Gisbert Ruhl, was taking them through a digital transformation. And his big concern was not that they meant it, right? But that his lieutenants, his middle manager cohort, would be so expert and so experienced at the way business was that they would just shut down these digital efforts. And he was very, very concerned about that. And he said, well, I need some way of making my message heard directly to the people that are on the front lines. And I also need a way of hearing from them what's going on. So he implemented Yammer, which he called non-hierarchical communication. And the deal was anybody in the company that had something he needed to know should feel comfortable sending him a note. And I'm told, I don't know this for a fact, but I'm told that at headquarters, he had his instance of Yammer set up so that the lower the hierarchical level of the person, the higher it came in his newsfeed. So, I can talk to my lieutenants anytime. Mm-hmm. The information I need is in the 24-year-old person who's just joined us with an engineering degree, who's looking at our manufacturing process for screwdrivers and saying, why do you do it that way? I've got a much better way of doing this. That's the information I really need. And he set up a whole system to try to get that information to himself.
Would you say there's a typical kind of leader with, some certain characteristics that's best equipped to spot the inflection point and, kind of lead the charge and get the organizations in line?
I think it's more the behavior. It's not their characteristic. So I've seen charismatic, attractive, movie star type CEOs be good at this. I've seen people you look at and you go, really? He looks kind of like he slept in his clothes all night. I've seen those people be good at it. So, I think the differentiation is this hunger for new information, this curiosity, this relentless, and tell me again. And so why was that? And why was that? And why was that? This urgent need to really learn what's going on. And then putting yourself in the context. So one of the people I'm working with right now is a brilliant retail CEO and everything. And one of the things he would do before hiring anybody into his senior team is he would spend a day or two walking the stores. And his explanation to me was, I want to see how they react to the stores. I want to see how they treat the people working in the stores. I want to see what they notice. I want to see if they notice that there's a thing out of array, or if I want to see how they are with me. Like if they spend their whole 2 days in the store visit sucking up to me, that's not somebody I need, And so I think the best leaders along those lines are people who are, relentlessly curious, bring people around them who are diverse. They don't just want echo chambers of themselves.
True. You don't want yes men if you really want to make an impact, really. Yeah. And how can I, as a person, train myself to also recognize these inflection points?
Well, it depends what the inflection point is, right? So if it's a question of you've been making nice, steady progress in your career and now you've hit some kind of ceiling and you just feel you're not growing or developing anymore, then that choice is really, okay, I need to, the way Whitney Johnson would put this, she's written a great book on this, on disrupt yourself, right? She says, you go up this S curve, then you need to make the decision if you're going to take on the J curve, right? Which is the part below the S curve before you get into the next round of learning. So that's a personal decision. You and really only you can make a decision like that. Then there are the cases where inflection points are thrust upon you. So you lose a job, your spouse has some setback, a family member is in urgent need that makes whatever you were doing before impossible. I mean, there's all kinds of outside things that can happen to you. And I think the best way to try to look at those is this a slingshot to a better future potentially? And, how many people have you talked to who got fired and some years later say that was the best thing that ever happened to me. It shook me out of my complacency. It made me think differently. And so I think a lot of times, it's very comfortable stuck in our ruts, and sometimes it takes a bit of a jolt to get us out of that.
That's a great one. Can I just ask you about, so it's not really about your book, the seeing around corners, but this one is about the entrepreneurial mindset. Just one quick question, because there's a quote in your book that says, a huge part of becoming an entrepreneurial leader is learning to simplify complexity so that your co-workers can act with self-confidence. That quote made me kind of be more conscious about, am I really making things simpler for my co-workers instead of, rather to enable us, achieve the best that we could as a group. So why did you make that quote and associate it with an entrepreneurial mindset?
Well, because if you make things complicated for people, there's maybe three responses, right? One is they'll start on whatever they start on, which is kind of random, and maybe they finish it and maybe they don't, but it's really, now you're leaving it to chance, because if you give people more to digest than they can manage, you're going to get back some fraction of that. So that's one thing. Second thing that happens is if it's too complex, a lot of times people will pick what they want to do, which may not have anything to do with the agenda that you want to set for the organization. And the third thing is there's just a laziness that comes from having things be complex. I know for myself, when I've had to do strategy statements for myself or my business, it takes a long, long time to get it down into a few simple things. And each word has to mean something. So as an example, some years back, I started a sister company. It's called Valise. And the strategy really is its mission, its purpose for being, is to help organizations create innovation and transformation capability as the basis for shared prosperity. And that sounds really simple. That sounds really kind of that sounds so grand. But I mean, the hours it took to get to that simplicity of statement. And then once you've got something like that, you can go back and you can say, okay, well, here's a thing that I'm being asked to do, or a thing I'm thinking of. Does it build capability? Yes, no. Does it build shared prosperity? Yes, no. Does it help organizations help themselves? Yes, no. And it sorts out a lot of stuff. I mean, there's a lot of stuff we could do, but there are only a few things that really fit into that sweet spot of shared capability. So having that simplification allows you to clear out a lot of the, there are always wonderful options that you got to do things, right? And it's a question of abundance. You've usually got more great options than you could possibly exercise. So picking the best ones is the challenge.
Wow. I'm going to listen to this part again. You've mentioned some books already, like Andy Grove's Only the Paranoid Survive, and you've mentioned the book Disrupt Yourself. Mm-hmm. In addition to these books and your wonderful suite of books, what other books could you recommend to the audience that you believe have influenced you, that you'd recommend to the listeners that would help them learn more about this topic?
Oh, that's hard because there's so many. Well, I love Safi Bakal's Loonshots. I think that's a brilliant book, and it really gets to the heart of how innovation actually happens rather than how we think it happens. I think I rather like Gary Hamill's and Michelle Zirinsky's book, Humanocracy, which asks the basic question, if you look at Instagram or Twitter or any of these social platforms, you see these people who are just brilliant. I mean, they're creating incredibly creative stuff, and then we put them inside companies and we insist that they do things by the rule, and we block all the creativity out of them. So why do we do that? I think that's a really great one. I'm very taken with Rebecca Henderson's Reimagining Capitalism in a World on Fire. Very, very brilliant. Roger Martin, When More Is Not Better. Just recently had Julie Lythcott-Hames on my Fireside Chat program, and she's got a book called Your Turn, How to Be an Adult, which is on a personal level, absolutely fascinating. Really, really good book. I like Peter Sims' Little Bets. There's just so many. I mean, I wouldn't even know where to start. Those are the ones that are sort of top of mind at the moment.
Okay. I'm scribbling away as you're talking, and all these would be in the show notes with the links to them. So that's great. Now, how can the audience reach you if they want to, follow your work?
Sure, a good place to start is my website, which is ritamcgrath.com. That's easy. I have columns that I write they're currently going up on Substack and Medium. So if you just search my name and Substack or Medium, you'll find me there. I do a weekly LinkedIn post, which goes to subscribers on LinkedIn. So that's all sort of good places to start.
Okay. Are you on social media?
Oh, yes. So I'm on Twitter at RG McGrath, and I'm on LinkedIn. Okay. I'm not on Facebook so much, but I have things I post there, but I'm not really on it very much.
Okay. All right. Thanks for those. Now, let's wrap up. Any ask of the audience first?
Well, I think we're in a remarkable moment right now. We've had so many of our previous habits and assumptions disrupted that I think it would be a shame to lose all that and just go back to the way things were. So I think it's an opportunity to reflect and to really think about, what kind of future do we want to build now that so many of our assumptions and institutions have been challenged, and we've learned whole new tricks. We've learned whole new ways to do things. Let's not just snap back to the way it was. Let's think about inventing better. Really, I think there's going to be great opportunity coming out of this current crisis, and those who are thinking ahead will benefit from it.
Okay, great. Well, Rita, thank you so much for your time, and it's been a pleasure again having you on the show.
Thank you very much.
That's all we have for now. Thanks for listening. If you like this show, do subscribe at www.agileinnovationleaders.com. That's agileinnovationleaders.com, or your favorite podcast provider. Also share with friends, and do leave a review on iTunes. This would help others find this show. I'd also love to hear from you, so please drop me an email at ola@agileinnovationleaders.com. Take care and God bless.